have now the great pleasure to introduce our next guest, Stephen Willats, and his manifesto, Explain Yourself. Stephen Willats is an artist working in London since the late 1950s. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Willats.
Yeah, well, good morning. Here we are, Sunday morning. Well, first of all, before I present you with this manifesto, which was written in the late 1990s, I just wanted to say that early on in the 60s, I did actually issue a lot of manifestos, and the idea of these manifestos at that point was to kind of try to define a psychological territory, a territory of sort of orientation and acceptance to ideas that might vary considerably from existing norms and values, in advance of a kind of practice, in advance of something happening. So you might issue this manifesto to a particular community or society in general, but my particular things that I developed at that time were to Pacific communities. Now, in the late 1990s, I was discussing with various people about the idea of setting up a sort of an internet site between artists. And the idea of this internet site was that really manifestos we felt were redundant in this new world we were living in. We were living now in a world that was based on the idea of flows of information and communication. When you think of a manifesto, it's like a kind of object language, a kind of blast. There's no way for the person to come back, or well, that's a bit like turning on a radio or something. And this seemed to be like a kind of a relic, really, from a past culture. And in the new atmosphere that we were in, we felt that artists in some ways should be able to have the humility and mutuality to be able to kind of explain their ideas in their practice and what they were trying to do. So this was the intention, and this is a paper, a kind of manifesto that I developed at the time, and I'm just going to read it to you now. It's called Explain Yourself, a proposal for an internet site. Hang on, I've got to get my glasses on. As a dream of a fluid, responsive social infrastructure built on the dynamics of exchange, effectively mapped out as long ago as the 1950s, now begins to shape the very parameters of existence in contemporary society. The artist's response to these basic shifts in the dynamics of perception in daily life has been strangely muted. For most art practice continues to operate within the contained institutional conventions of the art gallery, art museum, in the manner of an emulative icon to be witnessed but not interfered with or changed. And yet I see we are living in the middle of a revolution, but it's not a revolutionary moment led by the rhetoric of new manifestos, but is being driven through an evolution in technology over the last 20 years, a technology of interactive networks that are ultimately self-organizing and which have directly affected everyone's communication and processing of information. The result is plain to see as networks of exchange externalize into our daily life, and as a consequence, compatible states of consciousness emerge that have the potential to redefine our sense of self and our interpersonal life. While the ramifications that stem from this non-declared revolution would seem to extend into every realm of cultural endeavor, and certainly must be considered to have a direct bearing on anything concerned with the future, there is a seemingly stubborn or perhaps naive reluctance by artists fully to take on board what this means for an art practice that would want to be an effective part of that future. Instead, there is a reiteration, even a celebration, of cultural values associated with an object-centered society founded on a one-way network of transmission that projects the artwork as an icon of immortality, of the permanence and status of property. These projections maintain a mythical notion of sole authorship, the unique independence of the artist from the infrastructure of society. An important part of the mythical ethos surrounding the An important part of the mythical ethos surrounding the practice of artists has been that the artwork is in a competitive free will environment in which good art will somehow magically win out. But at the same time, at the core of this competitive environment, there is an institutionalized career path that will verify, legitimize competition into what it can hold up as good art. The resulting hegemony strived for in competition has been accompanied by a psychology that has reduced the complexity of the artwork's social interface. Closely linked to this reduction has been a tendency towards object-based perception. The containment inherent in objects detaches the self from the complexity of that interface. Coupled with this is an expression of the values of exclusivity, the holding of special knowledge being a prerogative within an authoritative cultural setup. Elevating the status of the holder, relationships between individuals caught up in this competitive and exclusive realm are highly demarcated, different territories of information being associated with a variety of specific identities, such as curator and critic, each with their own specialized languages, behaviors, and values. My point in going over this ground is that the infrastructure of art's social environment is instrumental in inducing conformity from the artist. The artist is locked into a deterministic modus operandi, the dilemma being largely compounded by the desire of the artist to conform, to be seen to belong within the realm designated as art. Once the artist moves outside art's social environment, the result has been the marginalization of their practice by the institutional vested interests of art, and through their absorption into other perceptual realms. For example, the response, "It is not art but social science," was experienced by this author when seeking institutional support for the West London Social Resource Project in the early 1970s. The pressure of marginalization and exclusion ultimately often results in artists merging their activities into these other realms, as much for the lack of economic support as anything else. Of course, this situation must be negative to the development of new practices and the adherence to the celebration of the object, rather than society, is certainly at odds with the cultural inferences that stem from communication built on exchange, fluidity, and informality elsewhere in society. For example, an important ramification to stem from exchange within interactive networks is the possibility of finding mutual agreement, a homeostasis, which in turn opens up the perceptual level of resolution to embrace the complexity and fluidity of relationships. This makes possible non-hierarchical one-layer networks in which information is potentially made freely available through the actions of question and answer. Unlike hierarchical networks, relationships are not formally set in stone, but are informal configurations, constantly changing shape according to needs and events. This conflict between the orientation of art practice and the changing parameters of society is a particularly polemical issue for the artist who wants to see their art practice intervening in society to transform perceptions of its future. A purely descriptive art reflects the status quo, the existing norms and values, perhaps even amplifies and reinforces them. And this is undoubtedly what most art does. A society gets the art that it wants. But an art practice which seeks to transform existing perception, recode how contemporary society cognizes itself and its vision of the future, will, if it is to develop any meaning for the particular moment, need to be seen to embrace the inferences that stem from emerging networks of exchange. Also important to this creation of meaning is the necessity of a consistency between what a work proclaims and the way it operates, to the point where even how the artist organizes the work's development and fabrication reinforces the significance it has for the audience. For here, consistency is important to belief, especially to maintaining belief when encountering an artwork that varies considerably from existing norms. Though dissonance can allow for the maintenance of credibility and for conflicts in consistency to be ignored, the relationship is always vulnerable and likely to collapse, leading to an almost instant reversal of belief. Such a reversal is fundamentally disappointing to the believer, the audience, and must surely inhibit their willingness to countenance any new propositions forwarded by the same artist or by transferred association with other like practices. In emphasizing this point, I do so because I believe that embracing paradigms associated with exchange and fluidity, the practice of the artist, how work is conceived, developed, and presented, ultimately has to be consistent with the philosophical ramifications that networks of exchange have for the self-understanding of interpersonal life and how it is lived. As previously indicated, a distinguishing feature of the interactive net from transmissional networks is the ability of the transmitter or receiver to ask a question and to get a response. The resulting two-way flows of information facilitate the understanding that the world is complex and in a continual state of flux and entropy. The recognition of complexity that potentially follows a question being raised in a network of exchange ultimately will pave the way for a psychological framework which encompasses mutuality. For a vital element in the response to a question is explanation, which attempts to complete what is missing in the picture of reality raised by the person asking the question. Here, explanation is filling in, completing what is missing. But another function of explanation is to establish in advance of an event a context so that it might be understood within a given framework of meaning, especially within a framework that is at variance with existing belief. Here, explanation essentially lays out a foundation or realm of meaning for approaching the future, in that a speculative framework of references and associations is provided for interpreting what is going to happen. So while explanation is an account of what has occurred, it can also indicate what might be going to occur. In this sense, it can also be used as a tool for introducing new encoding languages. An open network of exchange employs the ethos of explanation as a vital component in the creation of belief in the dynamic that will ultimately reinforce the complex dynamic of maintaining a binding between its participants. An open system of explanation between all participants in a network undermines the very foundations of authoritative, hierarchical, and exclusive frameworks. Perhaps, therefore, it's no accident, as previously observed when discussing the object, that there is a pressure exerted on the artist to maintain exclusivity, to separate practice from other practitioners, to declare sole authorship, to exhibit a unique language. But it's an important initial step towards embracing the present to acknowledge that this pressure will drag the artist back into a conflict between intention and practice, enabling meaning to be appropriated into value structures that will ultimately undermine belief in the potential ramifications of what is being forwarded. Only when networks between artists are fully independent of the existing value structures projected by the institutional world of art, and a consistency between intention and practice perceived to be true in the presentation of new artwork, will the artist be able to move the agenda of art forwards to embrace the potential of networks of exchange. Those same networks that are shaping the fabric of communication in society. An important starting point is the procedure and process of explanation which I would argue should be undertaken as a matter of course by the artist, of both existing and possible practice, the procedure of explanation being directed towards other practitioners to create an open network of exchange. Well, that's the text, and I think in front of me here somewhere are some little books where this text is reproduced, and you're very welcome to take one of these texts and think about these ideas in your own time and in your own space. Okay, that's it.